Okay, hi everyone. It seems like our participants list is kind of stabilizing, so maybe we'll get started for now. And if you have any other friends that would like to join, they can just like kind of move in and flow in and out as they need to. So yeah, this is the how to meta prep session. I am a big proponent of meta prepping, both in terms of my daily activities, in terms of reading lots for debate, as well as in terms of meta prepping, meta loading for a major. So we're going to be talking about both of those elements today, and just generally how to approach kind of content for debating and how to kind of get better at that. And kind of thinking about how we want to approach this as well. So yeah, in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to do why does meta prepping matter? Haha. What information is important to meta prepping? How do we meta load on a regular basis? How to case file for a major tournament? What happens when meta prepping fails and you still don't know what the motion's about, and kind of thinking about ways that we can address that, and also some Q&A. The Q&A sections at the end, just to make sure that everyone kind of has a place where if you have any kind of burning questions, you can kind of put it there. But also, if you have any questions during the session itself, you can feel free to pop it in the chat. And in fact, we will get started by thinking about why do you want to meta prep? And so I actually do want to make this a bit more audience oriented and want to ask people about your own reasons for why you might want to meta prep or why you might want to have joined the session. So if you want, you can don't be shy and kind of switch your mic on, switch your video on as well if you want, or if not, you can put it in the chat. Let's just maybe take 5 minutes or so to kind of think about what we want to get out of meta prepping. What's your motivation for doing that? Anyone? Don't be shy. We all have our different reasons for why we might want to meta prep, but like, can you think of some scenarios where meta prepping might be useful in debating, or like be a bit specific in terms of what skills you might want to learn from meta prepping?
I guess in terms of having a larger pool of stock arguments to refer back to, and I guess secondly, there are many motions where it's non-intuitive in the sense in terms of either philosophy motions or certain highly context-specific motions. To have some form of idea about that beforehand is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Whoops, I've just gone on to the next slide. But yeah, that's definitely true, I think. And a lot of it is like, as you guys mentioned, in terms of wanting to kind of build up on your arguments to prepare for what other people say, so that you don't feel stupid. That's very true. And definitely in terms of trying to like, as a context for whether you can either call people out in their bullshit or kind of situate your arguments in. So I made a short list this afternoon about, which you can see on the screen, which is like in terms of on top of what we've already said, some stuff about characterization battles at the macro and micro level in the debate, as well as spicy examples to kind of make your arguments a little bit more effective. In terms of characterization battles, I will say that sometimes there are debates that need characterization battles at a macro level. What I mean by that is in terms of like the overall debate, how the world looks, determines which arguments are more or less effective. And so some of these motions will require you to kind of be able to win the characterization in order to win for your case in general to win. That's what I call macro level characterization battle. And for micro level characterization battles, to me, it's stuff like trying to break the deadlock between on like a single clash, or in terms of how actors will respond to your policy, how actors are going to react to certain incentives. That's the kind of micro level characterization to show what actors care about, what their preferences are, and how they will therefore react. So both of those things are useful, and all of this list of things, as well as many other things, reasons for why you might want to meta prep, are all very, very valid for why you might want to meta prep. But it's good to keep in mind, because I think that that also affects how you meta prep. So you want to be able to, at the end of the day, meta prep in a way that addresses these objectives for why you want to do so, so that you don't really waste your efforts or your energy, right? You want to be kind of deliberate about what you're preparing for and how you want to go about preparing for it. Yes. Okay. Vicky, I saw your confidence thing as well. That's very, very true. Like, I definitely think that, like, I've had this discussion with a few people, and I think that some experienced debaters, some, not all, but some experienced debaters kind of scoff at meta prepping. They're just like, you don't need to meta foul. Like, you know, debates are about arguments, they're not about content. You don't need all these examples. But they don't realize that a lot of that is because they really, A, have the confidence, and a lot of them are like old schoolies or people who have been debating for years and years and years. And I think it's really natural if you're new to debating or your weekend debating, or just in terms of your debating style. Like, I like to debate a lot through examples and through real life like situations rather than just through pure like stock arguments and first principles. I think there's lots of reasons why your confidence would be improved and increased through meta prepping. So like, absolutely no shame in that. And I think that's a really, really good reason to know what is necessary to boost your own confidence and make you feel better on the floor as well. Okay, so what information are we kind of talking about when we're trying to look at meta prepping? Again, this is not exhaustive, but I was just trying to kind of come up with different angles that information and content can be used in order to make your arguments better. Because again, it goes back to knowing what you're looking for before you start reading. I don't really want you guys to kind of go away from this with like just a long list of like news outlets and podcasts and like different ways to get that content, but then you're just sitting at home furiously reading and trying to absorb without really having like a targeted form of figuring out what you need to know for debating. And I think that actually having that targeted objectives, or like having that deliberation when you're going about reading, makes it much easier for you to absorb the information and know what kind of information to look out for. A lot of meta prepping is about efficiency, and I'm totally going off topic here, but I think a lot of meta prepping is about efficiency because we don't all have time to spend ages and ages reading up, especially when like debate can be about anything under the sun and you don't really know what's going to be the most relevant. And I think that, you know, a big skill of meta prepping is also knowing when you read an article and when to decide, okay, I've got enough from this article. I kind of know what the article is trying to say, or I've got like reached like the utility peak of where I think like this article is going to be useful to me, and like this is now where I kind of back out the article, or maybe I save the article for later, I print it out. But either way, knowing when to disengage and move on to something that's more productive use of your time is also a really good skill when it comes to meta prepping. And how you get there is by knowing what information you need, and what information is going to be useful for you from a meta prepping session. So some examples are how systems work, things like political systems, healthcare systems, media, narrative, lots of other systems here at play as well. I think these are a big area where, you know, meta prepping can really help to like broaden your horizons to, for example, political systems in countries that are not like your own, or for example, even just like systems of governance and like what are the incentives in an authoritarian, okay, I'm gonna close messenger, that's really annoying. Yeah, what are the incentives in like an authoritarian or democratic regime? What are the incentives in a developing like country? What is business like just reading up on like how things work in real life give you a lot of color that kind of inform your cases and inform the way that you frame your cases, informs the way that you form arguments. For example, if you want to talk about authoritarian regimes, a lot of people say, a lot of people try to say like, oh, like certain authoritarian figures, they care about their domestic popularity, they care about like appearing authoritative and appearing like they're in charge, they're in control, as a very like strong man stance. But you really don't really kind of get the full appreciation for why that's so until you kind of really read up on like different kinds of authoritarian leaders. There are some authoritarian leaders that maybe have that strongman stance, and there are other authoritarian leaders that maybe have more of like a paternalistic stance, like they, or like some a lot of like military dictatorships, for example, they don't have that. Like they don't really rely on the strongman stance as often in some cases, despite what you'll think that when they're from the military. A lot of them rely on just being steady, stable forms of governance. They are able to just be like guardians and be able to be caretaker governments, and that's the kind of narrative or discourse that kind of goes around these regimes as well. So I find it's really useful to read up about regimes and political systems. I think the same could be said for like healthcare systems, kind of knowing how like the UK's NHS works versus like US like private healthcare, stuff like that. So how systems work is a big part of the kind of information that you're looking out for in order to understand what the different models are. I know one example is that Singaporean debaters very often always just say, we want to adopt the Singapore model for everything, for healthcare, for insurance, for education, everything. It's always just the Singapore model. And obviously that's because that's the matter that we know, right? Because we are very familiar with how our government like kind of organizes all of these like social policy structures and institutions. But it's also useful like when you're kind of mapping out your policy in a debate to kind of know what those models look like. Some countries are known for having really good models, like the Scandinavian countries have really good models. Some of like the Israeli, the Dutch countries, they have like interesting models that are quite different from what you would otherwise see reported in the Western media. And it's useful to also know how these like different models and mechanisms work so that when you're debating, if you have to come up with like a counter policy, or if you see a motion, you can be like, ah, yes, they already do that in like XYZ countries. So that's very, very useful, I find. The second area where I think information can be useful is in terms of actors, incentives, how they're likely to respond, what their preferences are. This is obviously useful for like actor debates, but I also think it's really useful if you are able to have like concrete examples to show their revealed preferences for what actors actually care about. And I think that that actually is the kind of stuff that like breaks the deadlock in many debates, and is also the kind of stuff that helps you to kind of do that actor specific analysis that often comes out in either rebuttal in deputies or in extensions in member speeches. You tend to kind of want to zoom in on actors to show how they were likely to respond to this, and why, for example, being strict with them will cause them to respond in a positive way rather than cause them to respond through backlash and worsening the situation, or vice versa if you're on the other side of the motion. So those kinds of arguments only come about when you know how actors have already acted in the past, and then you can kind of throw in some examples to kind of make your case more persuasive. So one example that I find is really useful, and I'm actually really bad at, is like sports motions. When you think about fans and whether, you know, they're going calling them out, it's going to cause them to like, you know, harden their stance even more in terms of, for example, racist attacks, or like attacks against another team or another player, or how you're going, or what is the kind of model that causes them to feel like the team can kind of rein them in and kind of reduce and de-escalate the kind of that situation. And in terms of backlash, how bad it can really escalate it, like for example football games when people are drunk and rowdy. You really need examples and instances of where this has happened in order for it to kind of sound persuasive. Don't look at me for those examples because I'm not good at sports motions and sports examples, but it's definitely something that I would like to meta prep on. And I think that those make it more persuasive, especially because generalizations very often are not persuasive. That's something that equity tells us all the time, not just for equity reasons, although those remain important, but also for debate reasons. When you just say like a whole group of people act in a certain way, it's not persuasive because you're just generalizing. You have actually not many reasons for why they might act that way. And so really analyzing, pulling up like past examples, a track record of them acting in a certain way, that can be useful to try and avoid the generalization and kind of have a more factual based track record based kind of argument for why they are likely to act in the way that your argument wants them to act in. So really we have to think about different kinds of topics, and I think I've kind of dabbled in this in some of my examples, but some topics require more example-based matter content in order for you to form your arguments. So for sports motions, it's really hard to form an argument, I think, without having a good understanding of the examples, the clubs, the players, you know, the history behind that particular sport. And it might even, sometimes it's like sports specific, sometimes it's not. But even just like how the industry works in general, those really often require examples. Art motions are very, very much stronger with examples, often because it's about how we react, right? It's about how our emotions and how we relate to a particular piece, and whether that is able to create some kind of discourse or some kind of message. I mean, everyone can say that a piece of art creates this message or that message, but which message is stronger and which message resonates with its audiences, that's the kind of thing that you need examples for. Other classic examples of like topics that a lot of people meta prep on is like IR, politics, war. I'll throw business in there as well, because I think that actually business, it's rarely called out as a separate debate topic, but I actually think that a lot of business related motions or business related arguments can be made stronger with knowing how the world works. And a lot of times, if like when I was like a first year in university, I had no idea like how the economy and businesses work, like it was really hard to form arguments. But I think there are also different kinds of topics like econ and philosophy, where you're kind of meta prepping for the principles, right? And this came up earlier when we were brainstorming and we were kind of talking about what we're looking for. A lot of times in philosophy, for example, you're kind of trying to understand like the principles and the different schools of thought in order to kind of form your arguments from there. So it's not that it's impossible to form an argument without that content, but that content makes you faster at thinking. It makes you faster at kind of looking at the different sorts of perspectives. And I think the same is the case in econ. I mean, econ is quite like technical and there's a lot of jargon. And by the way, I will show you my meta file later. I definitely had like a glossary section of all the econ terms so that I wouldn't see a motion and get scared because I don't know what that word means and then not be able to debate it afterwards. But I think a lot of econ also comes down to first principles, you know, what kinds of activity spurs the market, what kinds of activity causes investors to be like less confident, to be more unsure, and like, you know, what are the ramifications of that if there's capital flight, if they start like, you know, being more conservative in their investments, how does that affect overall economic activity? That's the kind of stuff that you're trying to learn the logic of it rather than trying to like just come up with examples itself. And I think that that lends to a different sort of meta prepping. And finally, you have kind of the feminism, environment, social policy. I'll add like racial politics in this as well. It's stuff that most people think they don't need to meta prep, but I'm here to make a case that you should absolutely meta prep for that as well. If you're someone that struggles with these kind of soft motions, definitely need to meta prep. You're just meta prepping the wrong way. And we're going to talk about how it's going to, what are the different ways that you can meta prep for that. So here's a table of the different kinds of topics. So the three sorts of like broad categories of topics I have on the left of the screen, and we've got some objectives that we want to get when meta prepping as well. I've kind of covered some of this, like, you know, hard content, you need content to survive. Without content, it's like very difficult to feel confident in debate and to come out with a good case. But it also is very broad. Like IR is like, it's a whole freaking world, man. How are you going to do that? And that's where I think you need to have a meta prepping approach that prioritizes breadth over depth, where you have depth at key strategic points that can be useful in lots and lots of debates, but you also need to make sure that you do cover a very, very broad range of topics so that you're not caught off guard. It's one of those kind of interesting areas where you might put a lot of effort into studying this one topic, and then if it doesn't come out in the way that you want it to come out, in the way that you're prepared for, you're doomed. Like, you know, like all of the effort just doesn't really pay off in that debate competition. And so what you want to do is prioritize making sure you have small bits of manageable information across everything, enough to survive, and then try to from there, from some kind of underlying systemic logic through the track records, through like IR theory, things that you can use as broad rules that you can then generalize everywhere else. Second topic about principles and logic of content, like philosophy, economics, you want to look at field specific principles and logic. So this is where a lot of podcasts like Freakonomics, Planet Money, that kind of stuff comes into play. A lot of philosophy stuff as well. There's tons of thought experiments that happen in philosophy that are very useful as intuition pumps, for example. That's the kind of thing you want to read up on to kind of firstly understand the logic of that field from people who have spent a lot more than just 15 minutes prepping for it. And secondly, then coming up with ways to condense that information and articulate that information in a very quick and concise and understandable way. So a lot of this is kind of taking a huge amount of content and trying to refine the way that you put your message out about it and kind of craft certain cases that you can use later on that are very, very clear. So that's one way of meta prepping as well. It doesn't always have to be about reading lots of articles. It can be kind of reading a few books and like longer pieces and thinking about it and thinking about how you will translate that into a speech, how you translate that into debate land to make it palatable and persuasive to the average judge. And lastly, in terms of lived experiences, this is where I think, you know, I mentioned before, I think people are meta prepping the wrong way. So I think a lot of lived experiences kind of topics like feminism, racial politics, social policy, it's always about kind of gaining the context and understanding, trying to be able to put yourself into other people's shoes. A lot of it is in terms of empathizing with people, understanding their struggles, and trying to really just kind of argue from the perspective of someone's life and livelihoods that's like different from your own, right? And I think that for those, you really need to meta prep in a different way. You need to kind of fully immerse yourself in that lived experience in order to gain more perspective that can inform your case to make it a bit more not just a bit stronger or more persuasive, but I also think to make it a little bit more empathetic and to make it a little bit more aligned to an accurate representation of people, because I think debate's also a lot about kind of represent different actors' lives and represent their struggle. And I think that there is some kind of duty, I feel, to kind of understand that properly rather than just debate about a topic that doesn't involve you, about people we've never met, in a callous way. Yeah. So in those cases, I think that actually meta prepping can get really fun. It can be about reading long form articles. The New Yorker is my favorite one, my favorite source for that. It can be about watching movies and documentaries, reading books, not just like nonfiction books, but actually fictional books as well. There are a lot of really good like historical fiction genres out there. There are a lot of really good books that can kind of put yourself in the protagonist's shoes to go through the struggles, put yourself in a different society. And that's where you can kind of get some of that, borrow some of those lived experiences as well. So the next time you want to watch a movie and Skype off on Netflix, tell yourself that you're meta prepping, but also choose a movie that can contribute to this. So this is my broad outline for how we can kind of look at different sources. Some sources, for example, like The Economist, is really, really popular among debaters. And I actually think that that's not because of the level of analysis that The Economist has. I think that The Economist does have a good level of analysis, but you can also get good analysis in many other forms. I think the true value of The Economist is that it has a section for every part of the world, and it really highlights some key issues that happen in those parts of the world on a weekly basis. And so if you really read through the whole of The Economist and you regularly read it, not just on the app, I think the hard copy is a bit easier for me in terms of flipping through and getting the gist of it really quick. I think you actually can get a good geographical reach of those topics, and to do so regularly, right? I think that it's another thing that I didn't put into this table is that the regularity differs in terms of which topics and what objectives you want when you're meta prepping. If you're going for like the kind of topics that you really need you feel like you really need content to survive, like IR, politics, you need to read up regularly because these things change on a regular basis. You can't just read up in the week before a tournament and feel like you know everything. There's a lot of content to deal with, and there's a lot of like developments over time. And even political opinions shift over time, and reading now about something that happened 30 years ago is very different from reading articles that happened, 30 years is a bit far. Reading now about something that happened a year ago with hindsight is very different from reading about something during that year ago when it actually happened, and opinions change on the ground really fast. So that's the kind of thing that I would say, read it regularly, get some kind of like source that gives you like regular daily, weekly newsletters in your email or something like that. Whereas things like philosophy, econ, you can put it off for a while. The field's not going to change so quickly. You can do it when you have time, but take the time to do a deep dive and kind of think about it as you read. Don't just absorb the content like as if like you're just trying to like shovel it in your mouth and your brain, but kind of think about it and kind of pause and reflect on it. Do something over a longer period of time. And I think that really will help a lot with how you absorb and retain that information. And for the lived experiences, I think that that's the kind of thing that I like to do in my free time when I feel like I want to relax. But I still feel like I want to be productive. And I think that's the kind of thing that you don't really need to have a regular structure like routine to do it, but it's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so the next topic that I want to kind of talk about then is in terms of how we establish like a day-to-day matter loading routine. So this is like, in our regular days, how do we kind of fit it into our lives, and how do we do this when there's no like pressing tournaments to prep for? So this is not like when we're prepping for a major. This is like, in your regular day-to-day life. I think it's important to establish a regular habit of reading, partly because it means that you don't miss out on content, you don't miss out on developments. Maybe that just comes from me in the Iona circuit where we have a competition every weekend. Like I always feel like I'm really anxious about trying to make sure I don't miss out on the latest news. And if that's the case for you as well, it doesn't have to be, but if it is the case for you, then maybe establish a regular habit of reading. So I used to read a lot of The Economist when I was commuting on trains. That's partly because London's really shitty in its train network and you don't get Wi-Fi when you're on the train. And I used to have a 30-minute commute into uni. And so I would sit on the train and take out my trusty hard copy of The Economist and kind of flip through it and actually jot down some motion ideas or jot down some case ideas as you go along. Other people like to read it in the morning. My boyfriend likes to read it when he's in bed before he gets up. He goes through the whole of BBC before he gets up from bed. That's great if you're someone that likes to like wake up slowly, and if you are not like me with a full-time job and that you're most of the time late for in the morning. Otherwise, read it over breakfast, over other meals. I actually do read a lot of content over breakfast, and I think that's a good time to kind of, instead of reading social media and scrolling through social media, get in the habit of scrolling through the New York Times, scrolling through Foreign Policy, scrolling through Vox, even just having like news aggregator apps and software like Flipboard or whatever not. If that works for you, like definitely go for it. You can tag like keywords and hashtags and like, get their software to kind of pull down all of the relevant articles for you. I find Flipboard to be quite useful for that actually. So that might be another way to put it into your lives. Some people like to read before they go to bed as well. Like I know a lot of people like, when you're sleeping and then you're in bed and you're trying to like get yourself off social media, but you just keep going on your phone and then like it's like past midnight suddenly. Do that, but be productive. Do it on news websites and kind of get some of the latest news. Other ways of putting it into a regular habit is I know friends who put it on Twitter. So when you're scrolling through social media, I use Facebook. So I also follow a lot of these like news article websites on Facebook. Then you kind of get it interspaced into your feeds. Instagram has increasingly had a lot of these as well. I do follow a lot of these accounts on Instagram. I prefer to follow like the more feminism kind of accounts on Instagram, environmentalism accounts on Instagram, because I feel like, kind of fits the aesthetic that I want on Instagram. But I also want to just caution you about fake news. I think that Instagram is one of the platforms that doesn't have as strong of a fake news thing as like Twitter and Facebook have been like being pressured to do. So be careful about that as well. And you kind of really want to make sure your sources are right. Find your favorite sources. I think that it's useful to find a source where the writing is kind of aligned to the kind of things that you like to read. The medium is aligned to what you like. So a lot of people like podcasts, and there's a lot of conversation on debate series posting for people's favorite podcasts. You can find lots there. These are just the ones that I go through sometimes. NPR, Planet Money, Freakonomics. Today Explained by Vox, I find is very useful. Lots of the other Vox podcasts are really useful. FT Weekly. I'm sure that there are more. And in terms of sources, these are some of my favorite sources. So you can see that it veers quite heavily into the politics and IR area, because that's also where I did my degree. And so when I was in university and debating, obviously like my strongest areas and my biggest area of interest is the overlap between my degree and between debate topics. And so I found that these websites were very useful for that, to meta prep in a way that also helps with my degree. So that's The Economist, The Diplomat, Foreign Policy, Vox, New York Times, FT. Those are all really, really good. Another source is also think tanks. So if you are more into the academia kind of stuff, or you want more like deep dive analysis from experts like CSIS, Council of Foreign Relations, CFR, those are some examples of like really, really good ones. And you can actually there are actually lots of like videos of experts online kind of debating and talking about like developments. So those are really, really good as well. I actually remember that there was one of these that like one of the experts was talking recently about the implications of the Biden administration on the Diplomat, the implications of the Biden administration on like different regions, and that was actually really, really well done. So if you're interested in that as well, like go give it a shout. Otherwise find other kinds of podcasts and whatever, radio, whatever that works for you. And I think that it's also worth doing a deep dive once in a while. So this sounds really nerdy, don't judge me, but I have done this, and a lot of my friends have done this. My boyfriend does this, and I've seen him do it. It looks pretty nerdy, but basically when you're reading an article and you have a question about something, like they mention something that happened, they mention like, I don't know, like the Clinton era like scandal over this, and you're just like, what the heck is that? Don't hesitate to take a deep dive. Go on Wikipedia and just like dive, like just keep reading Wikipedia and clicking links and like, you know, link jumping on Wikipedia. Just spend a good amount of time on it. And I actually think that that really helps in kind of creating a much deeper understanding that lots of articles are able to give you. Other ways in terms of books, like lots of other lots of debaters I know will say like, oh, I read this argument in a book or whatever. And actually books are a really good way of looking at arguments that way. It takes a while, but like, you know, pick your favorite books and like go read them. One way I find to find good books is I actually look at introductory texts for like a lot of like courses in university, and I try to find ones that are kind of more between the line of academia and pop culture, or like, you know, designed for easy reading. So political science has lots and lots and lots of these books. One example is Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It hasn't been disproved, so I wouldn't rely completely on it, but it has a very, very interesting perspective. Other ones are like Why Nations Get Rich or something like that, like those sorts of books. So like those are really, really good as well. Yeah, I think that it's quite interesting in terms of political bias in different sources. I think that it's something that's useful to be mindful of because you want to be responsible to yourself. You want to make sure that the information that you consume is information that you are willing to stand by, that you're not being misled by other people, that this isn't like very, you know, dodgy information or isn't presented in a way that's trying to manipulate you without you realizing it. So I think that's important for yourself and forming your opinions, especially if you're the kind of debater that forms opinions through debating or through reading. I feel like debate affects people in different ways. Sometimes debate causes people to form an opinion on something that they otherwise wouldn't have read about or cared about that much. And other times, I think debate causes people to just lose their hard opinions because they're so used to arguing on the prof and the off of everything that they end up just being quite moderate, being quite, you know, a bit indifferent towards some things that they otherwise usually would care about. So it depends on how it affects you, and I think you know yourself best. But I actually think that the most important thing about political bias in news is that responsibility to yourself, that you're not through meta loading causing yourself to change an opinion, because you've thought about it and decided logically that the opinion should change, but because you've been misled by other people with their own agendas. But in terms of meta loading, in terms of like what's the word for it? Like in terms of meta loading for the objective of debating, I actually think that political bias is not at the forefront of my mind. And I will say this with a big caveat that like I think that debate tends to be very left leaning in many circuits anyway. I can't speak for all circuits, but from my personal experience, it tends to be left leaning anyway. And a lot of these sources are also left leaning. So there is, I think, in universities and in the intellectualism world, there is a tendency to lean towards the left. So it's useful to know, but in practice, it hasn't affected a ton of my like sources that I pick from. And I think that actually, when I was younger in like first year of uni or like the last year of high school, I actually went on a spree of like following a lot of like right wing articles, like right wing sources on Facebook. Not the ultra right wing, but like the right wing media sources like Fox News, The Hill. Some people say Washington Post is kind of right wing as well. So I did follow quite a few of them just to kind of understand how they frame their message and make sure that I'm not being misled by the left in any way. But I found that actually, in terms of content, it changes the lens of the media. It changes what they report on and what kind of dominates the airwaves, but it actually doesn't change a huge amount of that content. Obviously, that's more true. Like what I'm saying is less true now, where news is very politicized, and you know, with Trump and fake news and all of that stuff. I'm sure that some of the content would have changed, but I don't think that it's necessary for you to go into like some super deep ultra right wing circles just in order to get some balance in your media diet. I would say if you're concerned, maybe look at do some reading on the news agencies that you would like to consume more of. But if you're just reading like one or two articles, don't worry about it. Another thing to say is like things like Foreign Policy Magazine. they have a lot of like editorial opinion pieces. So if that's something that you enjoy reading, I think that those are more enjoyable for argument generation actually. So there is benefits to that, but just be careful about where this guy is coming from and like kind of read up on his like on their background and whatever not, because I think that that also informs the way they write and like their agenda as well. So be responsible, but I think the responsibility is still primarily to yourself, you know, rather than to debating. Okay. Um, moving on. Okay, and then how do we meta prep for a major then? So like let's assume that like the meta prepping day to day kind of succeeds. You read on a regular kind of basis, or you listen to a podcast when you're doing your chores or whatever not. And then now you look up and you're like, shit, EUDC or WUDC or whatever other major you're prepping for is coming up in a few months, and you kind of feel like you need to meta prep. What do? The first step is, I think, you can ask seniors for help and you borrow their notes. So don't be afraid of doing that. Don't be afraid of borrowing other people's case files. But I would say that the approach to this is really, really important. This is something that I've done consistently. I think because I've been very lucky to have a lot of seniors who are both nerdy enough to have meta files, but also kind and generous enough to like want to lend them to me afterwards. Some of them I also find on the society Google Drive. So if you're in a society that has like an established Google Drive email account kind of thing, yeah, just sometimes just type in like meta file, case file, and you will be surprised at what pops up. Obviously ask for their permission afterwards as well, but they probably would have forgotten about it. But I think the important thing that a lot of people don't realize is it's not just about copy and pasting like someone else's notes into your file and printing it out and be like, I have a meta file, done. Because there's really no use in using someone else's meta file if you don't know where things are, if you don't really know what's going on, if they're not what's useful to you. So I would say use your senior's meta file as something, as a source of information that has already been condensed um, to what might be useful for debate, and use that to then read through it and form your own meta file. So we tended to like borrow a lot of like arguments, stock arguments that they already had, but in terms of content, for example, like my seniors were very good at econ because we're from the London School of Economics, but my partner and I were really bad at econ. We just like to lie to say that we were from LSE, but we were really, you know, not the typical LSE students. And we took a lot of their econ notes because they had a lot of really good econ notes. And so we could read off their notes and sound like we knew econ. We could look at the jargon and kind of knew what the context of that was. But that doesn't work if you also don't understand those notes. And so we made a glossary afterwards of economic terms that we did not understand. And that will be really useful as well. So, you know, be smart about how you want to borrow other people's notes. But other than that, I think you should also kind of think about what your approach is for a meta file. And I think this differs in terms of people, their speaking styles, like their reading styles, whatever not. Here's a few ways that your meta file can be used, right? Firstly, I think it can be used as a process of kind of going into your weak areas. So this is something I tried with one partner once, where we sat down and we thought, okay, I've got politics and IR. I'm good at that. In terms of specific areas, I'm good at Southeast Asia. She was really good at Europe. She really knew like social policy, charity work, like, you know, all of the like government, like non-governmental organizations, education, healthcare. She knew all that stuff. So like that was good. I was somewhat familiar with like war and peace ideas, with like defense, police. I was good on that. In terms of religion, we were like okay. In terms of technology, I was good on that. And so you kind of identify which are your areas where you feel confident and comfortable, and which are the areas that you're really weak at. So we were kind of weak at art. We were kind of weak at econ. Econ is something that I'm just forever weak at throughout my university career. Um, or we were weak at like sports, and then those are the ones that you identify as your weak areas, and then you do a deep dive into it. And so your meta file might have larger sections on those areas because you feel like you need more help. And it's in these cases, it's not always just about what makes it into your meta file. It's also about the process of reading through those articles and kind of just taking an hour to a week or something to kind of do a deep dive into that stuff, or taking an afternoon to just spend time researching that. And I think in the end, you do end up with a meta file that appears, but really it's kind of having spent those hours and invested that time that matters just as much as the actual file that you have at the end of the day. Um, a second approach that you can have to your meta file, and this is something that I did um, in a subsequent major, and I found more useful for me, is to use it as an external hard drive storage for your brain. So basically, I'm the kind of person that gets a bit frazzled during prep. It's like 15 minutes, you see a motion, you have a lot of thoughts, and sometimes you're like, shit, what was that fact that I knew, that I read about in that article, in that book somewhere? I can't remember. Or like for me, Euros is always after exams, and so I would have got my exam brain done, and I take a course that's quite relevant to debating, politics, and IR. So I end up spending a lot of time thinking, damn it, I knew that example from like, GV like 240, about this like one democracy that was in this like one region. Damn it, what was the name of that guy? And I spent a lot of time just thinking about it, and I find it really hard to like overcome that barrier in order to get to the actual damn arguments. And then my partners would be really frustrated, like, we don't care about that one example, just like come up with the case. But I knew that I like to build cases based off it, examples that I knew had happened, because I think that that's like a realistic picture of what had happened in that context in real life. And so I really liked having those examples. So an actual easy way that I did this is I just took all of my relevant exam notes. I didn't even reformat them into something that was useful for debating. I just put them all into one section of the case file, and I told my partner, you don't have to worry about this one. It's just there in case I forget something, and I know that I have a fact that I really, really need, and I know where to find it, right? Because if it's organized according to the way that I did for exams, then I'm already familiar with it. It's just there as a backup so that I don't have to spend all this valuable brain space trying to remember these areas and these little tidbits of knowledge, but to just put it in and know where I can go to find it. Another example for this is sports, and is in terms of like big important figures, so like either athletes in sports or in other areas, like I don't know, like like scientists, like female scientists in STEM, or like world leaders or whatever not. Like I'm really bad at faces, names, that kind of stuff, especially when they're from a region that's not on my own region, because it's so easy to like mix up a name and it's not a name that I'm familiar with. Okay, that's a lie, because I'm really bad at names even from my region. So I'm just not even going to make any excuses for myself. I'm just really bad at names. But if that's you, then come up with a list of names, come up with a list of like the world leaders, right? And past world leaders for the past like few administrations. Come up with like, I don't know, like a list of, I don't know, come up with a map of like the US if you have issues with that kind of stuff. And I think that that's the kind of, those are the kinds of content that is so easy to create just a reference list for yourself. And you sound impressive when you can say the names of like people and like refer to them or whatever, but it really shouldn't take up that much space in your brain. And so kind of preserve the real estate in your brain for the actual like thinking that you have to do in debates, which is very, very intensive on that. And be kind to yourself and put something that's kind of an external hard drive that you can use in that manner. uh yeah. And thirdly, I think another way is when you're stuck for arguments. So then this is a different kind of meta file, in which you can, for example, like think about like 5 reasons why democracies are not like the a priori end state for a state to kind of aspire to, or 5 reasons why free choice isn't the most important thing. Like here are a bunch of intuition pumps about when we really prioritize other rights over people's right to choose, or right to information, or right to like to run for office or whatever not. And then you come up with like a list of intuition pumps, you come up with a list of like reasons, and then in prep you can be like, okay, the base clash is whether or not this is like privacy versus the right to information, or economic development versus democratization, and transparency. And then you can say, okay, we've got this clash in our case file. You pull it out, and you're like, we've got like 10 reasons here, and I think reasons 2, 6, and 7 are relevant in this, or like are most persuasive in this context. And then you really have it there, right? So that's really useful. You can kind of almost prep. So you're prepping, right? You're prepping for these arguments before you go to a major, so that you make the most of your 15 minutes of time. Now you have hours beforehand where you can prep with your partner. And this can be done as like prep for a major as well, right? Like you can spend time going through cases, going through motions, you can spend time thinking of arguments for your argument list. And you think about it with your partner, and you come up with it, and then you have saved so much more time in the 15 minutes that you can now spend on being even more amazing at that debate motion and thinking of ways to beat your opponents. So that's one area where you can kind of get help when you're stuck for arguments. If it helps, like go listen to Naomi's like extensions lecture tomorrow, and I'm sure that there are also lots of other kind of list of extensions that you can have, so that if you're kind of stuck in closing house, you can also have a list of arguments for that. I used to have that when I was starting out in BP, because I just did not understand how BP worked versus like Asians in 3-on-3 formats. And yeah, coming up with a list of extensions that you could do also works in that. A fourth area that you can use the meta prep is if you want to research on likely areas to come up, for example, CA's favorite topics or regional topics. So this is something where I think it's more common for lots of people to say they have done. And in my opinion, if you're going to do it, you might as well write it out or print it out and put it in a meta file, right? So that would be, for example, looking through CA's like old motions and coming up with trends of what they are likely to set. I remember when I was prepping, we were so sure that, like, you know, with Dan Lahaf and Israel motion would come up, with Milosh, like tech motions would come up, with Lucia, like Mexico, Latin American motions, South American motions would come up. So like kind of know your CAs and kind of, you know their favorite topics, and then there's no harm in reading up on them. And also in terms of regional, yeah, I think CA stalking works. Like, I mean, I would say that like it's just like sometimes you want to meta prep and you're like, damn, I don't know what I want to meta prep. I just have some energy now. Like, just go stalk and like figure out what they like. Like, okay, I don't know if I should say this while we're being recorded, but like if you come to one of my competitions, I think there's like a 1 in 3 chance that you'll get like an Asian motion. So, like they're just like ways that you can kind of predict who has what motions. Obviously don't stalk them in real life, but there's a reason why CAs, especially of majors, produce those like long list of like motions that they have previously said before. You can absolutely do them. And I think that these are not mutually exclusive approaches, and there are a lot of ways to make them efficient. It's like, for example, when you come up with a motion for a training session, you go through that long Excel list and you pick out some motions that tend to come up from specific CAs, and then you debate it. And after you debate it, you think, I wasn't really happy with that case, or how did I make this case better? And then you go back and you read up, or you talk to the judge and you read up on like all of the like background knowledge and the facts and whatever or not, to make the case stronger, to think of some arguments that like came up or how to defeat certain arguments. And then you kind of use that opportunity and put it in your case file, right? So I think everything can go into a case file. I swear to God, okay, funny story, right? Like once, I went for Novi Sad Euros, and so a lot of the meta prepping I did was in terms of like coming up with just content on the Balkans, like part of the world, and like, the former Yugoslavia and all of the like kind of historical baggage that comes along with that. And one time, my partner and we were in a round about like history, uh, and like historical curriculum, something about Serbia, and we didn't know enough about this at the time, and we went up against like a Balkan team that was very, very good. And in fact, I also now very acclaimed, but I just won't mention it for my own pride and lack of embarrassment. And they were very good, and they were PM, they were OG, and they just match loaded and match dumped. And you know what? We just cut our losses because it was a training comp. Like, we knew that we weren't gonna beat them for the first. We were in closing, so it didn't matter a lot for us to be able to respond to them quickly. My partner, so I listened to the for rebuttal, and my partner just wrote word for word the entire PM speech in an entire OG case. And then we just put it in our meta file. And next time the motion came up, we were like, we have Balkans approved case on this argument, on this motion. So that works to watch debates, from speakers that you respect, from speakers that are really good at specific like motions, and write down their cases. I think in Singapore this is quite common, that we used to get kids to like go and type up transcripts of like famous speeches, and if they type it up long enough, they kind of understand what the structure of a speech looks like. It forces them. It's a very Asian thing, right? If like you write it and you type it, it forces you to be an active listener. So that you kind of absorb the knowledge rather than just like kind of zoning out and it passively crossing you by. If that works for you, like, go for it. And I think anything and everything can go into a meta file as well. And lastly, I want to kind of make the case for, some non-conventional things about meta files. It doesn't have to be like long paragraphs and bullet point lists of things. If you're a visual person like I am, I find maps really useful. I'll go into more detail about this later. But I learned this from Bethany Gary, who once gave us a lecture on Middle East. And the first thing she did was print a map without the country names and ask us to identify each country. And you'll be surprised at how much, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at how little debaters know about these things. Maps are so useful in any IR and geopol round. You can infer so much from a map. Other than that, visual guides, like I think I once had like a guide of like the US, because I debated a lot at like around the like Trump years, but also around the time when it was like Clinton versus Trump. So we had a lot of maps of like the US political map where like different states are like different colors and like whether they're rural and urban and all of those like demographics that can help you to predict like which ones are the swing states, and like if another if another team tries to like just bullshit and say that this is a swing state, you'll be like, ha, the state has been like Republican for the past 15 years or the past like 5 elections, or like they're super urban. They're not going to go swing into the Republicans. They're very firmly Democrat. And so that's how you kind of get some of that, right? So there's a lot of richness of information that can come from visual guides. Another one is when I was researching on like the China Belt and Road Initiative, One Belt One Road. I had tried to find a map of like where all those investments are going and what the actual belt and road looked like. And then you could see that it was clearly 2 roads. One was over the northern area that ends somewhere in Europe, actually, which is not very commonly known. I think the endpoint is somewhere in like the Netherlands or Germany, in that area. And then there's a southern maritime belt and road. And so actually you then realize that a lot of the considerations are very different in terms of the mode of transport and the countries involved, and even a country that might be involved in both ends of it might have very different views over like the maritime route versus the land route. So that would be useful as well. Come up with infographics if that makes you feel better. Like, a lot of environment kind of feminism kind of topics often have infographics. Like, those are useful, and if those stats help, like, go for it. And come up with tables. Like, if you want to condense information in a way that makes sense to you, I absolutely am a huge fan of tables. I use it in work all the time. My bosses will actually kind of yell at me at how much I overuse tables, but I find it a really useful way for me to understand information and to kind of make information make sense to me. So do that as well if that helps you. And then you can create a summarized list of whatever it is that you're kind of doing. Yes. And and lastly, like, I didn't put it on the slide, but I think a lot of times, like, if you watch like online lectures like this, or you watch like all the other great online lectures that the Madrid team has been putting together, that all the other like CA teams have been like putting together in many other majors and many other competitions, there's just so much content out there. Type it up and put it in your meta file. Like, basically, if your meta file is a repository for all of the information and all of the hard work that you put into debating, even if it's just a like list of your old cases, I think that anything could be useful. And you should absolutely not hesitate to put that in. So almost think of it as like an encyclopedia or a dictionary of all of the like information that you have, right? Cool. Yes, and then the second part of this kind of meta prepping for a major is you'll realize by now that my approach is like put everything in. So the meta file becomes really big and really unmanageable. And I want to make it really clear that in order for your meta file to be effective, you need to be able to navigate it. You need to be able to use it to its maximum benefit. And I think that there are 2 things to consider when it comes to this. Actually 3 things to consider when it comes to this. The first is that you need to learn how to prep with it. And that means that you need some way to organize it. So I'll share how my meta file looks in a while. But basically, you need to come up with a way to organize and to make sense of all of that stuff. So if do it on like Microsoft Word or Google Docs and kind of generate a table of contents, use the headings and section titles as a way to like automatically update a table of contents. That's how I do it. Other people would maybe do it in terms of like color-coded tabs, in terms of pockets. So like my partner was really good at organizing as well. And she would have these, like when we printed it out, she would have those like folders, those transparent folders that you put into into the file, and then you can slot the paper in without having to punch the holes. So we would have that, but we would not slot in like one piece of paper at a time. We would slot in sections at a time. So again, when I said earlier that I had a whole section of just like exam class notes that I found useful from courses that I found useful for debate, I would just put them in one section at the end, in one folder. And so she never has to deal with it. It's just like a thick folder that she just flips past. But then if I want to deal with it, it's all there. And then I have my own ways of kind of sorting through it as well. The same, we had a lot of like handwritten notes during majors. So we were really anxious, and during Novi Sad Euros, we spent a lot of time, a lot of nights wanting to feel better and feel more confident by watching debate lectures and by taking notes. And so because we didn't have a printer at the hotel, we didn't want to go find a printer at the hotel, we would just take out debate paper and hand write the notes, and then we would put it in at the back. And so we had a whole folder at the end of like that grew thicker and thicker of just handwritten notes from us. And then as long as you like title it appropriately and you like staple it or something, it will usually be like not that messy for us. But basically, you need to find a way to learn to flip and like use your meta file effectively, and you need to get used to that. It does take practice, and so I actually recommend that you do a few competitions with your meta file. So if you're prepping for Worlds, do Oxford and Cambridge IB with your meta file. If you're prepping for Euros, like the weekend before Euros, there's always a prep competition in the same city. Do that with your meta file. There's always like a few competitions before that. Do that with your meta file, and you need to kind of get used to it. And the second thing I want to say is that you really need to have rules in place during prep in order to kind of make sure that your meta file doesn't cause more harm than good. The reason I say this is because we tried to go with the almanac route. So some of you may have heard of this, some of you may have not, but basically buying an almanac that's kind of like like a like the CIA fact book or the Economist like World in 2021 fact book or whatever, like basically a book of all the country facts, a bit like an encyclopedia but for countries. And we used to have that. We bought one from Mexico, and we were like, okay, we're gonna know so much. And then we just spent all of prep flipping through this huge ass book and like not prepping, and obviously that didn't go very well. So you really need to have rules to institute into your prep. So some useful rules, obviously discuss this with your partner and see what works for you and experiment with it a little bit. But some useful rules that I've done is, firstly, I would try to do like we're only allowed to refer to the meta prep file during the first 3 minutes of brainstorming. So, if you don't know anything about the topic, you can flip through it for your own help, but you shouldn't spend more time than brainstorming time on it. Secondly, that only one person should refer to it at a time. The other person must strictly be thinking about arguments. It can be either one person. It doesn't have to be strict about which one does which role, but you want to make sure someone in the team really looks at arguments. And then thirdly, sometimes we would have like, when I'm writing cases, I'm a first speaker, so when I'm writing cases, then my partner, instead of thinking about clashes and rebuttal and whatever, can have some time to go through the meta file. Or for example, we take out relevant sections and we pull that out and bring it up with us, but we don't take the whole meta file. And so you want to try and cut down the amount of time you spend on it, and you want to make sure it doesn't distract you from the case argumentation itself. Obviously, this is a little bit difficult when, for some of you, you want to rely on the meta file to generate arguments. And if that's the case, then you need to come up with something that works for you. So maybe keep it to the first 5 minutes or something. Maybe change the format in which you come up with your meta file so that it's something that's easily readable, easily translatable into arguments, something that wouldn't overwhelm you with that amount of information. For a lot of us, I think a meta file is really about having something that makes you feel secure, so that no matter what motion comes out, you know that you're prepared for it. You won't be taken by surprise. And I think that doesn't really work once if a motion comes out and you start flipping through your meta file, and then you get really overwhelmed because there's so much information, and oh my god, what is important, what is relevant, where is that piece of that paragraph and that stat that I swear to god I had. If that's you, then make sure you don't get overwhelmed by all of this work. This work should be there to benefit you, and it shouldn't be there to make you feel more anxious and more overwhelmed during prep. And lastly, I think a meta file should be unique to your team and not to you personally. It should cover your weaknesses. It should be suited to how your team works. So in the way that I think some of the most successful teams at majors really had a sit down and discussion about the structure of their prep, the dynamics, who's good at which kind of cases, this is something that should be part of that discussion. And actually, I've heard from some teams that have stayed together. Like in Iona, I feel like it's a bit rare to have teams that stay together for that many years and that many worlds. But I've heard that some teams that do stay together for years and years actually do have ways to like kind of condense and make their prep structure really, really structured by time signals and really, really kind of systematized, and like your mana file should definitely be part of that as well. So even if you can't reach that level of like rigidity and rigor and just like comfort with your teammate, I think that your mana file should be a discussion between both of you. So you shouldn't be able to go from one team to the next and carry the same mana file over and just be like, here's my mana file. It should be something that takes a few months to come up with, at least. It should be an ongoing effort with this teammate. And afterwards, if you want to use the mana file with another teammate, it should be something that you take bits out of that can be useful, rather than something that you just copy and paste from one to another. So really like kind of take time and consider it as part of like a foundation for how your team works. Should be something that both members of the team are very comfortable with. Yeah. Cool. And then if all else fails, this is an IR example because I just pulled it from another IR lecture that I've done once. Here are some questions about what should you do to make your meta file still relevant to whatever is the topic that you have. This is an IR example because I feel like IR motions also tend to be the ones that you tend to be like, what the heck is that? Like, I know nothing about this country. Here's how your meta file can help, okay? So firstly, what region of the world is this, and which superpowers have an interest or presence there? This is where your meta file should absolutely have maps, and I really hope to God that your meta file will from now on have a map of every part of the world, right? Because it is exactly the parts of the world that you're not familiar with where a map will be the most useful. And actually you can from the map then kind of figure out which superpowers have an interest in that, who is the middle power within that region. So like who are like the regional superpowers, what are their interests. And by the way, a useful tip for regional superpowers is oftentimes they're either the ones with the most money, the ones with the most population, the ones with the most land size, the ones that have control over strategic areas. So either a very long border on one coast, or like control over like a very crucial like strait that like all the ships have to pass through. That kind of stuff usually makes regional superpowers quite strong. So those are useful ways to guess which ones are the regional superpowers. Secondly, any notable historical experiences that might shape the worldview in this country, in this context, in this society. For example, if you are not very familiar with colonialism, you might want to make a list of all the countries that the British have colonized, all the countries that the Spanish have colonized, etc., all the French, and the Portuguese, etc. That might be useful because then in an area that you might not be familiar with, let's say on the African continent, which many people don't have the kind of first-hand experience of and might not have a lot of knowledge about, then you can try kind of say, okay, like they were colonized by these countries, these are their experiences, or they were never colonized, or they fought a lot of wars, or whatever not. And you might be able to kind of guess at the worldview in that country, in that context, in that society, guess at some of the kind of debates that they have in public discourse, and sometimes be able to draw associations with something that you know a bit better. So for example, I think Novi Sad Euros had a motion about like African post-colonial leaders, and a lot of the logic that I had was from my experience in Southeast Asia, coupled with examples that I had from my meta file, which was about democratization, because that will also have post-colonial leaders. And so, kind of use that to take bits and pieces and kind of understand the picture on the ground. Do they have neighbors, allies, long-standing enemies? Is there anything that makes security a concern? Because that affects prioritization, that affects framing, that affects which countries they're close to. And so if you don't know about that, kind of look at the neighbors. How many neighbors do they share a land border with? Do they look like they're fighting? Like, are they landlocked? Does that mean that they're more reliant on one neighbor for exports than another neighbor? Stuff like that. So that's where a map, for example, will be very useful. How good is their economic situation right now? So that's where maybe a list of like facts and figures of like the economy, like economic indicators might be quite useful. So for example, I think you could compile like a list of like unemployment rates and whatever, or a list of like government like reserves, or a list of government debt and not to try and figure out the economic situation. There are a lot of lists of like all those rankings of like human development index, or like rankings about like the economy, about press freedom. Those are things that you can just kind of slot into your meta file. It doesn't take a huge amount of effort to collate and to format, but then it would be very, very helpful for you to kind of figure out in your head and draw associations to other countries that you might know better. And are they big? Are they small? Are they affected by regional instability or any other kind of trends, phenomenon recently are they trying to develop? So these are the kind of like just broad questions that you can ask yourself. And in a moment where your meta file fails and you don't have material in that specific country, you can still draw it out to other parts of your meta file in order to understand. And for example, if you know that like they are trying to develop but that they don't have like a strong democracy, and their economic situation is like, still in the developing country stage, then you know that there is like some argument about like the clash between democratization first versus like modernization and economic development first. And then you can draw back to your first principles that you might have in your meta file about how to weigh out those trade-offs. And then another alternative is that if you know, for example, that like they've had some kind of war in the past, or if democracy is very, very like fledgling, very new, then you can say, oh, this is obviously a priority for them. So then that can frame your points in some like generic stock points that you had, stock arguments that you have, and frame them to become stronger versions of them and become debate winning versions of them. And I think secondly, then this is also a useful way for you to kind of shape your meta file so that you have a bit of a safety net. So the meta file itself is a safety net, and then this is like a second level safety net, so that in case your meta file like filing doesn't go to plan, you know you have maps, you know that you have list of economic indices, you know that you have like, a list of like which countries are affected by those regional instabilities, or you can like look at the map and know, like vaguely know that a war has happened there in the last like 10 years or last 20 years. And that's how you kind of hedge your bets a little bit and make sure that your meta file works for you. Yes, so I think that is about it. I have another example that I want to kind of go through to show how this maps will work. But I know that I've also been talking for very long, so if there are any questions before that, I'm also happy to answer them and kind of push the Q&A session up a bit more before we kind of go into this like exercise. So yeah, feel free to unmute or pop your questions in the chat. Did I hear someone? Do I have a favorite documentary? Surprisingly, no, because I don't actually watch that many documentaries. And this is really funny because I actually did a course about documentaries as part of my degree. So I really have a lot of strong opinions about how documentaries are shot and like the composition and like, the structure of it. I care a lot about like the visual presentation, but I don't actually have a favorite documentary because I don't watch it that often. I suppose because it's not enjoyable to me anymore. I do have a lot of movies and books that I like that are useful for lived experiences. So I have very strong opinions on Hotel Rwanda for being like actually a very neo-colonial look, white man's look at like a particular at the Rwandan crisis. And I think that there's a lot of underlying imagery that often suggests that it's always like the white savior kind of complex, like the hotel manager who's the protagonist of the show. He's often dressed in like suits. He often like throws around like US dollars and like Western currencies as a way to kind of bribe his way out of situations. Yeah, so I really have a lot of opinions about that. An alternative movie that I would suggest is called Sometimes in April. It's a much better way of like showing the kind of insight into the Rwandan crisis. And yeah, I wrote an essay about this in school, and I tried to watch Sometimes in April, and I think that it's much better at showing like um, the before and after, the effects of after the conflict on people. So it actually has a series of flashbacks between things that happened during the Rwandan conflict and stuff that happens 10 years later, where people still don't know if their family's alive. They are trying to grapple with like these cases now being prosecuted in court at a tribunal, and trying to kind of come to terms with people that they knew doing horrible things. And I think that it's really, really powerful and really real at showing the continued effects of that, and kind of going into some of those dilemmas of like truth versus reconciliation versus rehabilitation versus like closure and the trauma it has on victims, in a way that I think just looking at the conflict itself in Hotel Rwanda is insufficient to do so. So I guess not really documentary, but that's my favorite like meta loading kind of movie. I would also recommend The Vanishing Half, which is a book about a pair of black twins, and one of them ends up passing as white and kind of becoming white and like living a life as a white woman after she gets mistaken for being white at some point in time. And then you compare between the two of them, twins, but one is black and the other one is kind of leading the life of a white person. That's really, really interesting, I think, at some of the like underlying racial politics. It's not just about black versus white people, but also within the community, the kind of like colorism and color-based biases that they have within the community and kind of norms around it. What sources would I recommend for getting better at first principles? Um, okay, so I think that reading introductory college texts can be worth the effort. You just have to pick the right one. So you have to kind of pick like textbooks are usually actually better than introductory readings. Like so, like if you want to learn like political thought, like finding a textbook that's about introductory political thought is better than reading the political thinkers themselves because they are really, really dry and really hard to get through. Um, but also try and convince friends that you have of their notes, because I think exams tend to go to the heart of those debates, right? About political speech or about like whether like I don't know whether modernization theory like works, modernization theory in terms of democratization. So like whether modernization causes countries to democratize, or whether it's like the economic elements of modernizing, like having more money causes you to agitate more for democracy. There's a whole like causal chain there about the middle class, or whether it's like cultural effects of modernization, or whether it's it's the other way around. That kind of stuff really works if you look at people's exam notes. Maybe I'm just a huge nerd. I just think the exam notes are always the most condensed form of information. But other ways to get better at first principles, I think you can find a lot of primers on YouTube about these. You can find a lot of debate videos from other debaters. And also I used to have this like Monash debating like training manual, which listed a bunch of first principles that you should know. And I can't remember how to get to it. I don't have it anymore. That was when I was in high school, so it was like quite a few years ago. But I think it's still out there. So if you like Google like Monash first principles, you might be able to find some of this stuff. If not, I think I'm quite certain that there will be online debate videos. And if there isn't, I will suggest it to the Madrid team as a kind of topic that we can put up at some future training workshop weekend as well. For economic principles, I actually think a lot of Econ 101 texts are really, really good. So I took Econ 101 when I was in university, and it was really good at giving me like a primer of how economics works. And then I read Forbes a lot. I read Forbes News a lot to get better at econ, and Financial Times. But I think Financial Times is a bit dry, mostly because it's like about British econ and like finance, and that's not the most exciting stuff. Like I don't know why the economy in the UK is just much less flashy than the economy in the US and the economic news in the US. But I find that like approaching econ from the perspective of business, approaching econ from the perspective of trade, of like investment, those are like, or even geopolitics with like the US China stuff, those are like my ways of getting entry level perspectives into econ in general. Yeah, so Forbes does a lot of like Disney news and like media, real estate, property, big data, internet companies kind of news, and then that's a way that I kind of get into it and kind of learn. And it has quite a lot of like explainers as well. Fox has a lot of explainers as well, so that's useful. Yeah, and there are a lot of podcasts about it, by the way. So I think that's another way of getting into first principles. Do I have any sample metaphors? Actually, yes. That is a very good reminder for me to try to kind of, yeah, let me try to share my screen. So I have a sample file that I pulled up. Okay, so this was my sample file that I wanted to show everyone. I haven't opened it in a very, very long time, but we made it on Google Docs. Pardon the title, I'm just being fun. This is the instructions that I had to make sure that everything popped up in the table of contents. And so this table of contents actually refreshes all the time and updates. If you click the refresh thing, it will update everything. We instituted page numbers, so you just have the corresponding page number, and then you can like flip to like the correct page number further down. So like you can see the page number at the bottom, right? And then we split it. So we did like EUDC training videos because that was the year of like Novi Sad EUDC. So that was the year that Scottish EUDC, who won the bid but didn't host EUDC, had a huge, really, really good training platform, and they had a lot of really good videos. So we all watched these videos, and then we took notes on it from those videos and put them in here. And we decided to put them at the top because we thought that was the most relevant to EUDC. And we had an overview chart. So this is like a list of all of the videos that they had and who gave them. And then the bolded ones are the ones that we want to watch. And then we kind of checked it off as who has watched what. And then we kind of split the work that way so that we didn't both watch it, because we were very big on pooling our knowledge and being efficient about things. As you can see, some of these videos we wanted to watch and we didn't end up watching. But, you know, we tried. And actually some of them we ended up watching during UDC. So like this Yugoslavia one by Ilya, I watched in the hotel room, I remember, the night before the semifinals, because I knew it was going to come out. It hadn't come out yet. And I was like, God, I don't want to make like an embarrassment of myself in front of so many people. After that, we had so many things. Okay, then we had prep topics. So these were the topics that we thought were immediately useful, that we didn't have any material on, and we just did a lot of like very, very quick research. Actually, if you look at the page numbers, you can see that each of these were not very long. A lot of them is like 2-3 topics on one page, but just very broadly in terms of like the European Union. That's because we were preparing for EUDC, so we thought that there was definitely going to be some kind of EU motion. It tends to have an EU motion. A lot of motions we thought could go through the EU as a mechanism, and so we wanted to know a lot about these things. So we had all of these parts: accession criteria, military bailouts, ECJ, candidate countries, expansion, whatever not. So Kira would do a lot of this. Kira's my partner, and then we would like put in brackets stuff that we would each do. So Kira was doing Brexit, Kira was doing Ireland. I was doing Yugoslavian history, Serbia. I did some sports stuff as well. Balkans, Russia. Yeah, these just went along with some of the stuff that I did in school. Israel, Palestine, just Israel topics in general, always very important. This stuff was borrowed from someone else's meta file, so like we would put that way. This was the year of the World Cup, and so I did some of that as well. And then we had some stuff about the IMF, which totally saved our ass because we had a motion about that in the quarterfinals. And then this is our favorite arguments. I'll scroll down later to like give you all a list, but I just want to go through table of contents first as an overview. So we like to take a lot of our favorite arguments that we notice, as long as we used it more than once, I think, so like at least twice, we would try to put it into a meta file because clearly we like this argument, and then we'll try to refine it. And so we make it the best possible version of the argument, and then we would put it in, and we knew that we liked them. And then we'll reach for them. And so the next time we wanted to do the argument, we had the case prepped, basically. So yeah, court decisions are random. Juries and judges suck. We love that one, especially for those like this House of ban plea bargain motions that came out very often. Democratization versus economic development. We knew like the back of our hand. This is a favorite extension topic of mine as well. And then we would use like other people's expertise knowledge. Like Drew Roussos has a PhD in philosophy, and so we would learn a lot from him about all his problems with utilitarianism, which is quite fun. Yeah. Yep, legitimacy in the EU. There's just some topics that like I feel like the same few arguments always work, like legitimacy in the EU. And those are instances where I think it would make sense that like you would have an argument prepped and ready to go, because almost every EU topic would have something about legitimacy, or like what the EU needs to function, what is its greatest threat right now. It's always about like backlash from Brexit and whether this will cause like other forms of Brexit. Yeah. Yeah, and then here we borrowed some stuff like why is it good to have more democracy? Why we should not have more democracy? Why we should cut back on democracy? When the state limits choices, when the state doesn't limit choices, and when the individual gives individuals more choices, why equality matters, why we should not act on equality. So you can see that these are all inverses of the same few topics. They just like do both sides. And then we had a list of them. I can show you later. And then these were like stuff that we borrowed from other people. So like this is like from Debate Camp. This was from Daniel Bramble's Econ Notes, and this is from Hannah's notes as well. And then we would just like borrow sections, and we refer to it later. And then I had my class notes, so I did organize them in the end. And like I wrote it out. Yeah. And then we had a country index and a list of legal and economic jargon. Yeah, not just economic jargon, but I thought legal jargon tended to be quite specific as well. And then we had maps at the end, just so it doesn't mess up our formatting, because those are really annoying to format. Yeah, so I can show you a bit of what this happened. So these are notes from training videos. So again, we used like headers, and we were quite strict about using the headers. You can find them here. So header 1, header 2, header 3, and that will ensure that the table of contents comes up properly. And then we'll take notes about this. It doesn't have to be long. As you can see, Lucia's stuff was like quite quick. Melda's stuff on Turkey is very good. I think it's still up. I found it very useful. Yeah. And historical issues. Oh yeah, this is Ayal's lecture on Israel-Palestine. You can see that the formatting differs as well. It's just whichever works for us. But we do try to bold things that are very useful and keep in mind that it should be something that we can refer to quite quickly. And then this is some stuff about the EU. Kira likes tables too. This is great. And then some examples along the way. I'm trying to scroll through to get to some of the more interesting parts, but this is a 150 something page document, so it's also a bit hard to load it. And that does get some kind of cumbersome. So one way is to like split into a few files if you can bother enough to do that. Yeah. Yeah, so I had some like characterization, different countries, a few stats and stuff. I found that percentages of population was really important for the Balkans, because that really, really does affect the kind of racial and ethnic demographics. So there are some parts of the world where this is more important, other parts of the world where it's less important. So like make a judgment call, but don't hesitate in putting that in as well. Yeah, and there are parts that I just didn't get to, and it's like fine. This is supposed to be what we wanted to aim for, and if we just didn't have time, that's okay as well. Let me try and get to the parts about our favorite arguments. Oh yeah, so this is useful. Like for all the economic organizations, like the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, lots of different, the AIRB, they all have different like instruments that they use. And I think it's actually quite useful to come up with a list of like things that they do, so that, you know, in a debate, like I think in the quarterfinal debate that we had for Euros, which is still not up, and I keep messaging the organizers to put it up. We actually, the opening house, it was about the IMF and whether they should use like monetary policy, which means like adjusting interest rates, whether they should use give that they should, if they're bailing a country out, whether the country should then have to give up all of their rights to like determining monetary policy to the IMF to use instead. And a lot of opening house was a debate about austerity and whether or not this would be politically palatable for people to like accept austerity and the imposition of austerity measures. And we POI and said, no, but monetary policy actually is about interest rates, and austerity is a fiscal policy. And so actually, if you know like the difference between these policies, you're debating the wrong debate, but also that the IMF currently does impose austerity measures, but it doesn't really do that much on monetary policy. And so that would be really useful to try and make like opening house not as relevant. And that was very, very useful to us. So yeah, this list, like this is monetary and financial policies, this is fiscal policies and management. And it was really useful to like know the difference between that, and to know some of the other stuff that IMF has done. Donor countries as well is very useful. That kind of stuff is really useful for stuff like the UN peacekeeping countries are actually not what you intuitively think they are. So like go research on that as well. Yeah, and then success stories and horror stories, so that you can kind of just have a few like pocket examples that you can pull up about areas where they did very well or areas that they didn't do very well. Yes, favorite arguments. So we did have like, God, I swear we had these arguments somewhere. I don't know why they're not in this. But yeah, we did have like favorite arguments. Joe Rousseau has something that's like, what's wrong with utilitarianism? And this is totally beyond us, but we put it in anyway. And then we had like, yeah, democratization versus economic development. And then we made like a few key tables of like the differences between the two and the two sides of the debate, to show why either one would be useful, and in case of we were arguing on either side. Sometimes we use this as a work in progress thing as well. So I will be like, find a list of examples. I know that this happened and someone told me that this happened, and so I should look at it. And then you can go back and look at it later. Yeah, and then we had a very long list. Yep, court decisions are random, juries suck, emotional labor is unrecognized, backlash. So we had a lot. It's just like very, very quick list. It doesn't have to be very long, but I think it can be very useful in terms of coming up with what works. Yeah, and when is consent valid? How do we do arguments, impacting arguments? These are often, we use these as like just making sure that we're being thorough and we're not forgetting like a comparative, we're not forgetting a premise, like a tipping point or whatever that's important to analysis. So if you're the sort that like your speeches get quite messy, or you get like, you know that you should include tipping point analysis, you know that you should include a counterfactual or comparative, but you just forget to do so, or you know that you should have mechanisms and you forget, like make a checklist of for yourself, and that can also be in your meta file, just so that you read it before you go off and you make sure that you have something to say on all of that. Yeah, and then these are our reasons for why it's good to have more democracy and reasons why we should not have more democracy. So again, we have like maybe 8 reasons here, and we don't use all 8 obviously in a debate. We just pick and choose which ones are the most relevant for that debate. But it's useful because then we can look over the list together and be like, okay, these are like, we know that we haven't forgotten anything, but these are all the reasons, and we will be deliberate about which reasons we've reached for, so that we use the most persuasive reasons because they are persuasive and not because they're the first thing that pops into mind. So we like that it took a lot of that intellectual labor out of it sometimes, so that we could spend our brains thinking about more important things. Yeah. And then at the end, I want to show you the maps at the end as well. Yeah, my notes are very long. We had a very heavy, big ring file that we used to bring around for competitions. You'll think it'll be easier for online debating, but it really isn't, because then you end up having to like carry it around. Oh, okay, the maps aren't here. I think the maps actually are in a different version of the file. It might not be on Google Drive because the pictures got very annoying. But we did fill up all this. Yeah, see, there's a section of maps here, but we did have a lot of maps here, and we did fill up a lot of these definitions. I remember filling them up. So yeah, it's probably just in a different file. But yeah, that's an example of the kind of meta file that I would use. I'm not sure if that's helpful for y'all, but yeah, that's one way to organize it, and that's one way that the material that I found was useful for myself. Yeah. Any other questions? I don't think that it helps us intimidation purposes. Yeah, like we just kind of look kind of nerdy, and we had like overfilling bags, and it did not make us look very fashionable, which was definitely a priority for my team. But it served its purpose, and I think we lost the meta file sometime after. When it stopped being important, we were just like, I don't know where it is anymore. I know we definitely had it during semifinals, because we used it during semifinals as well. Yeah. Okay, if there are any questions, you can pop it in the chat, but otherwise I would quickly go through just this. I know that we're running slightly over the 1.5 hour mark, and I do want to make sure everyone gets a break before the next session, but just maybe like to go over some of the things that you can use to glean from this map. So I'm using a map of Southeast Asia because I'm familiar with this region, and I want to show y'all how useful a map can be in terms of figuring things out when you don't know anything about it. So this is a map of Southeast Asia. I like to have it a little bit bigger so you include other players like India, China, Australia, just so you have a little bit of context. And from here, you can kind of see a few things. So let's say the motion's about the South China Sea and you don't know anything about the context at all. You can tell which countries are most likely to be affected by the South China Sea because you have Vietnam over here that's really, really close. So the South China Sea is here. Wait, can you see my mouse? I hope you can see my mouse. Let's see. Is there an option for me to annotate? Yeah. Okay. So the South China Sea is, whoa, that's not an option to annotate. Oh, spotlight. Okay. Does this work? No, it doesn't. Okay. God, I hate Keynote sometimes. I'm gonna stop sharing for a bit and fix it, and then kind of come back to it. Yeah. Okay. So clearly I can't annotate, but hopefully you can see that the South China Sea is somewhere here, and you can see like Vietnam is right next to it, and the Philippines is right on the other side. And so you would know from looking at this map that there's a good chance that Vietnam and Philippines have quite a significant amount of investment in this issue. Indonesia is a little bit lower over here, but actually East Malaysia covers a lot of the Bornean Indonesia border with the South China Sea. So actually Malaysia cares about South China Sea a little bit more than Indonesia does, just a little bit. And that's something that I find a bit surprising. And other useful things is like Vietnam shares a border with China. So they would have, Hanoi, for example, would have more Chinese influence coming in and would have quite a lot of like Chinese investment in that area because it's very near to like some of the southern borders of China, near like, is that Nanjing? But yeah, like, you know, there's just a lot of Chinese stuff, Chinese investments in this area. A lot of the Chinese, by the way, a lot of the important Chinese like business economic centers are all tend to be along this like southern coastal region and some of the northern coastal region as well, like Beijing's kind of northern, but it would be along that border. So Hong Kong, Guangzhou is here, you know, yeah, and like Shanghai and Beijing are further up, but they are definitely along that border as well. So you would expect a lot of Chinese investments to come into Vietnam through that border, but at the same time, parts of Vietnam also care about the South China Sea, and so you can see that in Vietnamese political discourse, there will probably be some kind of tension there, or there will be people with various interests in each, depending on which industries that they invested in. So if you were in like Vietnamese like fishing industry, right, you would care a lot more about the South China Sea. Whereas if you were like, for example, producing factories, textiles, you would be maybe caring more about Chinese investment. This is like a guess. And I think that that's one way of trying to like figure out what's important. For example, if you had a motion about Vietnam and about like what is going on inside in those internal political dynamics. Also, fun fact: a lot of Chinese factories in Vietnam end up having like to deal with the ramifications when things in South China Sea happen like that are seen as acts of aggression or are seen to escalate matters. They suffer the blowback because there are Chinese factories there, and then they will have like lots of protests and riots and whatever not in front of those factories. Yeah, and similarly in Philippines, like Manila, so close to South China Sea, as compared to Mindanao, that's a little bit further. So like, for example, President Duterte is actually from the southern Philippines islands over here, and that maybe affects some of his like preconceived notions and his worldview when he's like looking at China, because he didn't grow up with like the Chinese threat right on the border in northern Philippines that you see in like Luzon Island and in Manila, as compared to like, you know, the southern islands. And in comparison, the southern islands, they're a bit closer to Indonesia, they're a bit closer to East Malaysia. And so there's actually this area in the Sulu Sea that actually known for like piracy and a little bit of like, yeah, like cross-border arms trades kind of stuff. So that might happen in this area, right? But I mean, you wouldn't know that from the map, but you would know from a little bit of context, and then reading up on it would help you to like piece together what makes sense in this aspect. Other examples are like, for example, if I asked you about like Thailand, and you had a motion about Thailand, you will be able to see that actually Thailand is quite a big country in Southeast Asia, but also has a lot of borders, right? So Thailand borders Myanmar, where there are a lot of tribes along this border, and it borders Laos and Cambodia, which means that it's part of the Indo-Chinese bloc in Southeast Asia, because these are all the countries, these mainland countries are all the ones that have strong ties with China. And at the same time, southern Thailand also borders Malaysia. So then you can think, what are their border relations with Malaysia? What are their border relations with Laos and Cambodia? And if you research a little bit more about it, you'll realize that there's a lot of complicated history between the borders in Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, and to some extent to Myanmar as well. These borders are not the most well defined, and they have histories of like battles and wars, the Indo-Chinese wars, the two of them, but or maybe three of them, can't remember. But yeah, then you can go back and read up on it, and you'll realize some of those implications. But at the same time, countries like Laos are so dependent on, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia to be able to access those maritime ports, and because they're landlocked. And so because of that, there's also some degree of pressure to kind of make peace with their neighbors and be more cooperative, so you don't hold grudges as strongly as you would otherwise have if you had that many wars between neighbors. And the southern border between Thailand and Malaysia actually has quite a lot of interesting people who, right, residents who stay across the border and like work and live across that border. And so actually southern Thailand tends to have some degree of like Muslim demographics, which I think is not very intuitive to people who are not familiar with the region. So that's quite interesting as well. And of course, you have Singapore and Malaysia, which share, I wouldn't say they share a border, but they're part of like the same straits, and the Straits of Malacca connects China, these ports along the coast on China that we talked about, it connects them to India, right? So if you're looking at the maritime trade, this is an important trading route because you can't really get past this region without it. And that's what Malaysia and Singapore often compete about in terms of their shipping and maritime sectors. They want to be the port that you stop at. So if you're going through this bit, will you stop at Singapore, or will you stop at Malaysia, or will you stop other parts along the Malaysian port on this side of the port? So yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you can care about. And obviously Indonesia is huge. And so if you had to take a guess about what was a regional, well, who was a regional power, it would be reasonable to say that Indonesia would have some degree of ambition and some degree of regional leadership, because they're so big. Look at them. They're like, yeah, compared to the size of Malaysia, compared to the size of Thailand, of Myanmar, like they're huge. And so this is probably true. I think Indonesia does have some degree of regional leadership. And I'm from Singapore, so I'm also biased that Singapore has regional leadership, but that's because of other measures such as economic modernization and wealth. So yeah, like, if you look at this map, there's a lot that you can infer about the Southeast Asian region without necessarily knowing too much about it, but also in a way that helps you to identify where else interesting. So let's say if you were coming for Bangkok Worlds that happened 2 Christmases ago, starting with a map of Southeast Asia would have been very, very useful to you figuring out where are some interesting borders that I want to read up on. And then, some borders will bear fruit, and there will be lots of interesting historical baggage there. And then you can have a really, really good, rich discussion and rich understanding of what's going on in those countries along those borders. And then other borders maybe are less contentious, and that's okay. You can just have a good understanding and move on as well. So like if, for example, I was giving a lecture on how to prepare for Southeast Asia for Bangkok Worlds, this is what I would start with my first slide. And I think you can do the same for lots of other areas. Like I know with Seoul Worlds coming up, the Korean Peninsula is very interesting to read up on in terms of its proximity to China and its proximity to Japan. And similarly for Euros, like, the European map is always very interesting as well. Yes. Any other questions? How long did it take for me to make that Matterfall? We did it over summer. I think we had a chat. So Kira and I were teammates at Mexico Worlds, so we did do something there, but not really a Matterfall. And then we had a chat after Mexico Worlds. We like to have a chat after each major to talk about what worked and what didn't. And yeah, we had a chat then. We came up with topics, and then we had a proper chat after exams in, I want to say, June. Yeah, in June. Yeah, so we had a chat in June, and that came up with the list of topics that you saw in the meta file that we had directed like each of us to research. And then we spent a few hours in June doing that once school was out. And yeah, and then we spent a lot of time doing preps as well. So Kira and I would do maybe like 3, 4, 15-minute preps in a day. It would just be like a 1-hour call, so 1-2 hours, and that would just kind of set us up to like figure out our OG strategy and be more comfortable. And through that, we also ended up prepping the topics that we wanted to prep about and research about, so that we'll feel more comfortable. And so a lot of those favorite topics lists that we had either came from prep tournaments that we did in the UK, or it came from during those prep sessions that we had. So I would say that it took a few months, but it wasn't like a concerted, like I'm going to spend the whole day doing this. It was just like an hour or two a day during summer. From like June to August to put together a lot of that, I think. Yeah, not too long. Definitely manageable during the holidays, especially after you've done exams. Nothing can feel worse than that. If I got it right, Vietnam's always on China's side with the South China Sea issue. because of the investment in its border. That's not true. Because Vietnam's a claimant in the South China Sea. So actually China trying to dominate the South China Sea actually and trying to assert its dominance here actually results in clashes with Vietnamese fishermen and results in clashes over like Vietnam's territory. So I had another map that had the 9-dash line as well as like the economic zones of each country, and you would be able to see that a lot of the 9-dash line just basically cuts into a lot of Vietnamese like waters that it will otherwise have access to. So it's not true that Vietnam's always on China's side. In fact, Vietnam is one of the loudest claimants that tries to challenge China in the South China Sea. A little bit even more than Philippines, I think, from my experience and to my knowledge. I'm not the expert, but it seems to be my impression. So it's not always the case, but obviously Chinese investments on the border does complicate matters as well. And that's also the case in the Philippines, where like a lot of Chinese investment has come through the maritime BRI. It comes right through Philippines because you can see, right, like the moment China leaves these shores and wants to go along the maritime BRI, Philippines is almost always the first port of call on this end. So there's a lot of investment in the port infrastructure there as well. And so obviously Chinese investments does complicate some of these things, but I don't think it's true that Vietnam always takes China's side because of the investments. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, great. Seems like everyone's happy and good. So yeah, that will just be the official end of the lecture. I'll hang around on video for about maybe 5 more minutes in case there are any burning questions. Feel free to DM me as well. And if you can't catch me here, you can also message me on Facebook. But otherwise, best of luck for Euros or whatever competition that you're going for. And I hope that you have a really productive time just finding out more about the world, not just for debating, but for yourself as well. Thanks for tuning in.